So I want to ask you about your process, because for people that don't know too much about how you work, so many of the things we might talk about arise from the process of your production. So can you just explain how you make these works?
These are paintings made with urethane resin and pigment, and the material lends itself very nicely to being made inside of a rubber tray instead of painted on a canvas. And if I painted them on canvas, they'd become very heavy and there'd be a lot of dust that would accumulate as it's drying. Whereas if I'm painting it in a tray, all of my marks collapse into one flat plane. That's something I learned very early on, about 7 years ago, when I started using this material. And it became a problem to solve because when I started painting into trays, it is backwards. You know, you're painting into something, and in the case of these rubber trays that I make, you can't turn your head around and see the face of the painting. So it starts out as something that I very clearly see what's going on, and as more paint accumulates, that's obscured. And for that reason, they tend to be paintings that are both fast, and kind of a lot of the movement in the painting is based on those first marks that are happening in the foreground. And also the material is quite fast drying. And so I've become really interested in how quickly a painting can be made, where a painting can kind of be a moment. It's like a touch that then is kind of frozen in time. As I've continued on using this resin, the imagery and the kind of the formal qualities of the paintings have adapted alongside what the material lends itself to do.
I mean, you give almost an entire sort of ownership or agency to the materials that you're working with. That seems to be quite an important aspect of this process, which leaves a lot to some chance and accident, because you don't entirely know quite what image is being produced until you then expose the image after it's been built up over time.
Yeah, I'd say if it was a graph or something, maybe there's a lot of control in the first third, which is seeing exactly what's going on. Then there's maybe the second half of the painting, which is a lot less control, because the paint is maybe interacting with other colors and things are happening that I can't see from behind. And then there's the final third, which is actually editing that work and deciding what is a painting. Not every single cast that I make is a painting. There's kind of a period of time where they sit, usually in my studio, usually for at least 6 months, and I'm kind of getting to know them. They happen fast, and then it takes me a long time to decide which ones have character. That's why I keep them around, because sometimes I could be really excited about something that I see initially, and it kind of fades, like burns bright and it fades, and then the ones that I actually want out in the world are the ones that maybe continually do something that's perplexing or enigmatic, and have personality.
Yeah, I mean, in all aspects of your work, the way it's presented, be it outside or on the wall, more conventionally, like this, you have a really acute sense of time. I think it's true to say that time is almost like a kind of material in your work, would you say?
Yeah, it's a big aspect. I've always been drawn to abstraction. And what I've found for myself is that the most interesting things happen when they're not too overdetermined. It's not this, but I always liken it to like being in class and drawing in the margins, and like just daydreaming and drawing. Like It has lightness to it. There's a naturalness, and for my last show here, I wrote this text about improvisation and jazz, and the purpose of that, I'm not a scholar of music in any way, but was just to kind of talk about what's the difference between music that's composed in time and kind of has, it either works or it doesn't, versus something like Bach, where he could spend months composing 2 minutes of music and perfect it in that way. And I don't think there's a competition between those two kinds of beauty, but in my work, and especially with this fast drying material, I'm far more interested in something sort of happening in time, and these are one shot. So it's kind of like just hitting the record button and playing. You're not going to zoom back and, at least in jazz, replay a piece. You just have to start from the beginning and do the whole thing over again.
I mean, I think the relationship between, say, abstract expressionism and jazz is sort of really established kind of relationship. But I know that for you, working within the legacies of abstract expressionism, which is so sort of terrifyingly heroic, and just the responsibility of trying to move the media on from a legacy of abstraction is quite, I think, daunting. But you're very attracted to that. You were talking earlier about working on the floor, and even those working practices that connect you right into a generation of a movement of art. Can you talk a little bit about that?
The first time I showed these resin paintings, they were sculptural. They were corrugated, and they had undulating surfaces. And I thought I was showing something that really was quite radically different. And someone came in and said, well, of course you're an American painter. You won't ever separate yourself from the legacy of Jackson Pollock and abstract expressionism. It's whether you're for it or against it, there's a string tied between you and those people, which really stuck with me, and that was 6 years ago. I do like a lot of that art. I don't have a lot of interest in making my own heroism. That language has been cartooned, I would say, at this point. Like it no longer has the authenticity of when it was first made. So I'm not trying to ape that. I still think it's possible to have a painting essentialized to gesture. And I don't really think about these as gestures so much as I think of them as touch. But I do think the language of a painting can still be composed primarily of a few strokes or drips or whatever, and that is all set up by abstract expressionism. So you can't get away from that, even if maybe I'm trying to tilt in a different direction. Because
of your focus on process, and also the way that you almost remove yourself from the possibility of a heroic gesture, it hijacks the process in a really interesting way, certainly for me, because you're not trying to have this heroic, expressive moment. You're actually removing yourself from that process and allowing the media over time to kind of become really what's foregrounded in work. I feel like it's talked about more in the history of ceramics, and Bernard Leach and Japanese villages that were making ceramics and doing things with slipware, and the mark making that was happening. And I did live in Japan for a little while on a residency, and did visit some of these places where they were making all these plates and pots, and at the end of the day, the slip that was left over, they would just make a few fast marks. And of course, there's a whole connoisseurship around those marks now, but they were
fast and basically abstract, but I am really interested in all of that.
One of the ways in which I think your work is very different and disruptive of the language of abstract expressionism is that your works don't seem to have these immersive agendas, like i.e. that they're of a certain scale that would occupy almost your field of vision. You still feel like you're looking at a sort of surface of sorts, like you've zoomed in to the detail of something or zoomed out on a macro scale. So the scale of the work and the way that the images are produced, I think is really interesting in relation to the kinds of digital cultures, the technologies that we're also familiar with now, where you can zoom in to an image or zoom out from it and have a different kind of spatial relationship due to the scale. Is that something that you think about in your work, or is it just a natural product of it?
I think it has to do with the fact that I'm quite determined that whatever my version of formalism is, which we all have, some sort of aesthetic where we think something works, is about an internal logic. I think initially that lent itself for me to like a kind of all-over abstraction, but I think, like especially if you're looking through this show, there is no all-over abstraction. It's all sort of things that have brushstroke or different hot or cold areas within the picture, but I still think those parts fit together, something like maybe it's just the influence of nature or that I aspire to, where things are linking up with each other. They're all one shot. They're all about doing it simultaneously, basically. And I think that kind of links into what we're talking about here, is like, how does something have that cohesiveness? It might have the unintended consequence of looking like photography or looking like a picture of something that exists in nature. And I think oftentimes when we're zooming into anything, it's this thing that, under a microscope, everything ends up looking like nature.
But it's also the overt flatness, because of course then you're working with lots of things that could be impasto, built-up surfaces. But they look as if you're looking at a mediated image through a lens, or like, say, an iPad or something, where it's been flattened out. It's a very interesting effect, and I think it's partly because of how compelling the images are and their scale. But this flatness is a feature of the way in which artists in painting are picking up the aesthetics of our digital services and our technologies. I believe that. It's
very important to me that they're flat. I think it creates a different sense of space. And I also wrote this small thing about recording techniques. And in particular, this thing was about the wall of sound, where, in the 60s, when there was only AM radio and single channel, and Phil Spector, not necessarily a great figure, but he would record, say, on the second floor and then run a line down one or two flights, set up a pair of speakers and a mic, and then run that back up to the floor that he was recording on to create this almost like micro change in the amount of time. And that little tiny change created a big sound. And it was, and then it all got pushed into one channel of audio. And I think it's kind of the same thing here, where I'm taking a constraint, which is total flatness, and seeing how it's possible to actually generate more space in flatness.
You're very attracted, it seems to me, to the residual opportunities, as you say, the marginal things.
Yeah, that happen.
I guess they're more generous, really, aren't they? They're less, as you say, less heroic, and there's less expectation around them for things to actually come together.
Yeah, I think that's like singing in the shower, or so, like singing when no one's, listening to you or something. Like there's something very genuine that happens that kind of gets back to the jazz versus Bach or something. Like, it's not more beautiful than a professional singer who really refines things, but there's a kind of beauty in it, and I am really interested in that. And then I think that also goes back to a certain reflections of nature. You know, one is like looking at the perfection of it, and the other is looking at the kind of perfection and the chaos and, you know, what hasn't been laboriously controlled. And my brain seems to lend itself better to trying to create an overarching system where chaos and mess can happen and still reach a kind of beauty than just constantly whittling down one thing and finding perfection that way.